Jack Callahan's blood boiled as he watched the last of his prized Holsteins being forced up the steel ramp of the livestock trailer. The cattle bellowed in distress, their hooves slipping against the metal floor as unfamiliar hands prodded them forward. He clenched his fists, his fingernails digging into his calloused palms. This wasn't just a livestock seizure, this was a public execution of his family's legacy, and the woman leading it knew exactly what she was doing. Evelyn Whitmore stood a few feet away, her manicured fingers gripping a stack of official-looking documents. Her lips curled into a smirk as she watched Jack's cattle disappear inside the truck. "Your property?" she scoffed, holding up the papers like a trophy. "Not for long, Callahan." She took a step closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "I've waited 20 years for this moment." Jack turned to face her, his blue eyes burning with unmasked fury. The hatred in her voice wasn't just about enforcing HOA regulations. No, this ran deeper. This was personal. "This ain't about property values," he growled, his voice low and steady. "This is about revenge." Eve's smirk deepened. "Revenge? That's a strong word." She tilted her head, mockingly thoughtful. "But if that's what you want to call it, fine. Your father took everything from my family. I'm just returning the favor." Jack's stomach twisted. Suddenly, the years unraveled like a snapped fence wire, and the memory hit him like a gut punch. The Jenkins farm, once bordering his eastern acreage, had gone under during the agricultural crash of 2005. Eve's father, Walter Jenkins, had borrowed heavily from Jack's dad to modernize his operation, using his land as collateral. When milk prices tanked and Walter couldn't pay, the farm had defaulted. Jack's father had no choice but to foreclose. It had been business, not personal. At least, that's what Jack had always believed. But Eve had spent 2 decades thinking otherwise. The crowd gathered along the fence line, some whispering, some openly recording. Neighbors, old friends, and new residents from Meadowview Estates stood shoulder to shoulder, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. A news van had pulled up on the road behind them, cameras rolling, reporters murmuring into their mics. Eve didn't care. In fact, she thrived on the attention. Jack's jaw tightened as one of the workers yanked too hard on a heifer's halter, nearly causing the animal to stumble. "You watch how you handle my cattle," he snapped, stepping forward. "They aren't yours anymore," Eve said smoothly. "They're a nuisance. A health hazard. And they're being removed per county regulations." Jack forced himself to breathe, slow and deep. He wasn't about to let her see him crack. She thought she had him cornered, that her connections, her money, and her husband's influence had stacked the deck in her favor. What she didn't realize was that every insult, every threat, every smug look she gave in front of these cameras was playing right into his hands. Because Jack Callahan wasn't just standing by and watching his livelihood get ripped away. He was letting Eve walk straight into a trap of her own making. Jack Callahan stood rigid, his heart pounding against his ribs as the last truck rumbled down the dirt road, kicking up a trail of dust and betrayal. His cattle, his legacy, were gone. But he wasn't beaten. Not yet. He turned back toward the onlookers, locking eyes with a few of the Meadowview residents who had moved into their pastel-colored homes, expecting rolling green pastures without the realities of farm life. Some looked uncomfortable. A few had the decency to glance away. But others, like the retired banker from Chicago, watched with smug satisfaction, convinced they had won a battle that Jack hadn't even begun to fight. He spat into the dirt and walked back toward the farmhouse. His phone vibrated in his pocket, the umpteenth call he'd ignored since this nightmare began. He glanced at the screen. Sheriff Tom Bennett. He hesitated, then picked up. "Tom." "Jack." The sheriff's voice was low, cautious. "We need to talk. Something's not right." Jack pushed open his screen door and let it slam behind him, rubbing a hand down his weathered face. "No kidding." "No," Tom said, his voice sharpening. "I mean legally. I did some digging. Eve's got her claws in the county deeper than we thought. The zoning board, the health department, hell, even the real estate commission. And Jack, your farm's not just an inconvenience to the HOA. It's a roadblock." Jack frowned, moving to the kitchen window, staring out at the land that had been in his family for nearly a century. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Tom exhaled, "Eve and her husband stand to make millions if your farm is rezoned. You're sitting on the only land separating Meadowview from their Phase 2 expansion. If they get rid of you, they connect the developments and increase their buildable lots by 30%. Jack's grip tightened on the phone. He had known it was personal for Eve, but this? This was bigger. This wasn't just an old grudge, this was corruption wrapped up in greed, disguised as community improvement. And she wasn't done yet. The next morning, Jack had barely finished his first cup of coffee when the call came. A sharp, businesslike voice informed him that due to a health violation, his dairy supply was being recalled statewide. "E. coli contamination risk," the woman said flatly, as if she were discussing the weather. "State health code violation. Your milk is being pulled from shelves immediately." Jack nearly crushed the phone in his grip. "That's not possible," he said, keeping his voice level. "I had an inspection last month. Passed with flying colors. We have photographic evidence of unsanitary conditions," the woman replied. "Mold, waste runoff, improper refrigeration. The decision is final." Jack didn't need to see the photos to know they were fake. His farm had been meticulously maintained for years, and every customer, from local markets to high-end restaurants, knew it. But Eve had played her hand brilliantly. By fabricating a public health crisis, she had done more than damage his reputation. She had crippled his business. Contracts would be cancelled, customers would lose trust. The financial blow alone could take months, maybe years, to recover from. His hands shook as he hung up, not with fear, but with rage. Eve Whitmore was trying to starve him out. By noon, local news had picked up the story. "Longtime dairy farm faces contamination crisis," the headlines read. "Health officials recall milk from Callahan Farm." It was everywhere. Customers began calling, hesitant, worried. Some, the loyal ones, promised they didn't believe it. But others, the new ones, the ones who had only heard the HOA's side, started backing away. Jack stormed into town, fists clenched, jaw set. He went straight to the agricultural board, demanding an independent inspection. By evening, the results came in. His milk was clean. No E. coli. No contamination. No violations. A complete fabrication. But Eve had gotten what she wanted. The damage had been done. That night, he sat on his porch, staring out at the pastures that suddenly felt smaller. The land had always been a part of him, an extension of his family, his history. He had thought that fighting Eve meant standing his ground, proving her wrong. But now, he saw the bigger picture. This wasn't just about him. This was about every farmer who had been pushed out by developers, every small-town family that had watched their land get swallowed up by luxury homes and corporate greed. This was about something bigger than a grudge. Eve had money. She had power. She had county officials in her pocket. But Jack had something she didn't. The truth. And he was about to make damn sure everyone saw it. Jack Callahan wasn't the kind of man to take a beating lying down. He had spent his whole life weathering storms, droughts, market crashes, even the slow creep of suburban sprawl, but nothing had prepared him for the level of corruption and personal vendetta Eve Whitmore had unleashed. She had played her hand, using her power and influence to strip away his livelihood, but she had underestimated one thing: his ability to fight back. The morning after the false contamination scandal, Jack sat at his kitchen table, flipping through the stack of legal notices the HOA had buried him under. Eviction threats, nuisance complaints, zoning violations. It was all an elaborate web meant to tie him up in litigation while Eve and her husband, Greg, carved up his land behind his back. He rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of it all. His phone buzzed again. He almost ignored it, but when he saw the caller ID, he grabbed it immediately. "Jack, it's Maggie Thornton," came the steady voice of the agricultural historian. "I read the news. This is worse than we thought." Jack exhaled sharply. "Tell me something I don't know." "I've been researching your farm's history for years," Maggie said. "And I don't think Eve realizes she's stepping into something bigger than an HOA dispute. Your Holstein line is one of the few remaining bloodlines traced back to the original 1920s importations. That makes them eligible for heritage protection under state law." Jack sat up straighter. "Heritage protection? If we move quickly," Maggie continued, "we can petition for official historical designation, not just for the cattle but for the land itself. If we secure it, the HOA won't just lose jurisdiction over your farm. The county and state will be forced to acknowledge it as protected agricultural land." For the first time in days, Jack felt a glimmer of hope. But he knew it wouldn't be enough. Eve was playing dirty. He had to be smarter. Later that afternoon, he met with David Langston, the director of the local Agricultural Heritage Museum, who confirmed Maggie's findings. "We've been wanting to preserve sites like yours for years," David admitted. "But no one ever acts until developers move in. This could set a precedent, not just for your farm, but for every farmer facing the same fight." Jack agreed on the spot. That evening, legal paperwork was filed, transferring his cattle's official ownership to the museum under a living agricultural exhibit. On paper, they were no longer livestock, they were historically protected assets, and that meant Eve's removal orders were now legally void. Jack wasn't done. His next call was to Rachel Carter, a former classmate turned environmental lawyer, who specialized in land preservation cases. She listened as he explained the corrupt zoning approvals, the fake health violations, and the clear conflict of interest between Eve and her husband. When he was finished, she let out a low whistle. "This isn't just an HOA power trip," she said. "This is textbook fraud. If Greg Whitmore pushed through development approvals while ignoring environmental and heritage impact assessments, he's not just breaking zoning laws, he's committing an ethics violation that could invalidate the entire development." Jack leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. "What are the chances of proving it?" Rachel paused. "We'd need evidence that the board ignored mandatory environmental studies. Official county documents, emails, something that shows they knowingly approved development without proper assessments." Jack nodded. "I know just the guy." That night, his phone buzzed with a text from Tom Bennett. "You need to see this." Attached were blurry photos of Eve standing in front of a projection screen at an HOA meeting, displaying fabricated images of Jack's farm, showing rundown fences, sick cattle, and contaminated water sources. None of it was real. She was using staged photos to rally the HOA board into pushing through emergency action against him. And then came the kicker. "They're planning something big for tomorrow morning." Jack scrolled to the next image, his gut tightening. It was a document, an emergency HOA motion stating that a county environmental team would be arriving at his farm in the morning to conduct a full investigation. The accusation? Contaminated groundwater. Jack's mouth went dry. He knew exactly what that meant. Eve had set the stage for her final move. And she had just given him the perfect opportunity to expose her. The morning air was thick with tension as Jack Callahan stepped onto his porch. Dark clouds rolled across the horizon, fitting for the storm that was about to unfold. Along his fence line, a crowd had gathered, neighbors, reporters, Meadowview Estates residents, and even some old friends who had stood by him through this fight. He could see the division in their faces. Some had come in quiet support, others in smug anticipation, eager to see the dirty farm finally taken down. At exactly 10 o'clock, the convoy arrived. Eve Whitmore stepped out of her sleek black SUV, her camel-colored pantsuit crisp, her expression smug. Behind her, a line of county officials, HOA board members, and a hired crew of livestock transport workers moved into formation. She let the moment breathe, reveling in the silent authority she held over the gathered crowd before speaking. "Let's get this over with," she announced, her voice carrying across the farmyard. She turned to the county health officer standing beside her. "You have the orders. The cattle are a public health risk. Begin removal." The workers advanced, their heavy boots trampling through the muddy pasture as they made their way toward the barn. The cattle, sensing the shift in energy, stirred uneasily. A few lowed in distress, their instincts warning them of an unfamiliar threat. Jack took a step forward, his expression calm, measured. "Before you proceed, I need to understand exactly which regulations my farm is violating." Eve's lips curled, pleased to entertain his last-minute resistance. "We've documented multiple violations: excessive noise, noxious odors, and, most importantly, groundwater contamination." She gestured to a clipboard in the hands of the county official. "The HOA has unanimously determined your operation to be in clear violation of Section 7 of our community standards." Jack nodded as if considering her words, then reached into his own folder and pulled out a stack of official documents, each bearing the seal of the Agricultural Heritage Museum. "That's interesting," he said, his voice carrying just enough for the reporters to hear. "Because as of 3 days ago, these cattle are no longer mine." Eve's smirk faltered. "What?" "They're museum property now," Jack continued smoothly. "Recognized as historically significant livestock under the state's Agricultural Heritage Preservation Act. Any attempt to remove them would constitute destruction of protected cultural assets." The murmurs rippled through the crowd. David Langston, director of the Agricultural Heritage Museum, stepped forward. "The Callahan-Holstein line is one of the last remaining bloodlines directly descended from the original 1920s importations," he explained. "That alone grants them a heritage exemption from any zoning or HOA restrictions. These animals are no longer livestock, they are living historical artifacts." The color drained from Eve's face. The county official flipped through the papers, frowning. "If these documents are valid, we don't have jurisdiction to remove them." Jack saw the way Eve's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she wasn't ready to back down. "Not yet. This is nothing more than a loophole," she spat. "It doesn't change the fact that the farm itself is a public health risk. We have photographic evidence of unsanitary conditions, contamination in the creek, and..." Jack raised a hand. Yes. That's the part one was most interested in." He pulled out another sealed legal document and handed it to the county health officer. "Because, you see, this land itself was officially granted historical agricultural protection 4 months ago." The official's brows shot up as he skimmed the document. The gathered news reporters took a step closer, cameras zooming in. "That's impossible," Eve snapped. "Such designations require public review, environmental impact studies." "They do," Professor Maggie Thornton cut in, stepping forward. "And this one went through all the required legal channels. The public notices were printed in the county record for 6 consecutive weeks, all adjacent landowners were notified, and the zoning board," she glanced pointedly at the county official, "acknowledged receipt of the application." The weight of those words landed like a hammer. Eve's expression twitched, her carefully constructed facade slipping as the realization set in. Jack wasn't the one violating regulations. She was. The county official turned to Eve. "If this land has a historical designation, then any developments approved without an environmental or heritage impact assessment are potentially in violation of state law. A murmur of unease rippled through the HOA board members. One of them, a distinguished woman in her 60s, stepped forward. "Eve, you assured us that all necessary permits were in order. You specifically said there were no complications with adjacent properties. But this," she gestured to the historical designation document. "This changes everything." Another board member, a sharp-eyed businessman, added, "You told us Callahan was operating illegally. You never mentioned that his farm had heritage protection." Jack didn't hide his satisfaction as he pulled out the final piece of his trap, a certified mail receipt, signed by Greg Whitmore. Robert Greg Whitmore, chair of the zoning board, was officially notified of this heritage designation 6 months ago. Jack held the document high enough for the reporters to see. He knew. He ignored it. And the zoning board pushed through development approvals anyway, in clear violation of state environmental and historical protection laws. The shift was instantaneous. The reporters turned their cameras toward Eve, microphones extended. "Miss Whitmore, can you explain why the HOA pursued enforcement action against a legally protected heritage site without informing board members? Did your husband knowingly approve illegal zoning permits for developments benefiting his company? Was the contamination complaint staged to accelerate the farm's removal?" Eve stumbled back, speechless. She had spent years orchestrating her revenge, only to walk straight into a legal disaster of her own making. Her breathing grew shallow as she realized the truth: she wasn't just losing. She was about to be destroyed. She turned sharply on her heel and stormed toward her SUV, shoving past the news cameras. "This isn't over," she hissed toward Jack, her face flushed with rage. Jack just smiled, tipping his hat. "Oh, I think it is." The storm didn't end with Eve Whitmore's retreat, it only marked the beginning of her downfall. Within days, the county launched a full-scale investigation into the zoning board's actions, and as more documents surfaced, the corruption became impossible to ignore. Greg Whitmore resigned from his position within 2 weeks, citing personal reasons, though the whispers of backdoor deals and illegal permits only grew louder. Eve tried to salvage her reputation, but the damage was irreversible. The HOA board, furious at her deception, held an emergency vote and removed her from her position unanimously. Meadowview Estates, once the battleground of her personal vendetta, became the very thing that unraveled her. But Jack Callahan's farm? It thrived. Under new leadership, the HOA did something no one had expected: they approached Jack with an offer of partnership. With Eve gone, the new board, led by residents who had moved there seeking an authentic rural atmosphere, realized that the farm wasn't a nuisance. It was a feature. They proposed seasonal farm-to-table events, educational programs for local schools, and even community gardening plots where residents could learn sustainable farming. What had once been a war zone became a collaboration, bridging the divide between old and new. The change extended beyond Meadowview. The county implemented stricter zoning regulations to ensure developers couldn't override heritage protections again. Neighboring farms, inspired by Jack's fight, applied for similar historical designations, creating a protected agricultural corridor that would preserve the land for future generations. Even property values in Meadowview Estates increased as buyers now saw the farm not as an eyesore, but as a unique, desirable feature of the community. And Eve? She quietly sold her home and left town. She had spent 20 years plotting her revenge, only to destroy herself with her own ambition. Jack stood by the fence one evening, watching the sunset cast golden light over the rolling pastures. His cattle, now protected under law, grazed peacefully. Children from the neighborhood helped plant seedlings in the community garden, their laughter drifting on the evening breeze. He had spent so much time fighting to protect his land, and now, for the first time in years, he felt something different. Victory. But not just for him, for the history, the heritage, and the future of the land his grandfather had fought to build. Sometimes, the best way to win isn't through confrontation, but through preparation. And sometimes, the ones who seek to destroy you end up being the architects of their own downfall. Have you ever had to stand your ground against an HOA or a power-hungry neighbor? Share your experiences below. Let's see who had it worse.